Baobab Brilliance, Perspectives on Audacity, features Black women who are the embodiment of don't speak about it, be about it. Black women who write the vision and make it plain. I'm your host, Makiyah Moody. Let's get into it.
Tyra Mariani, it is so good to see your face.
Hi, Miss Makiyah Moody. It is wonderful to see yours as well and hear your voice, of course.
Yes, it has been a minute, and I'm so excited that you have said yes to this conversation on Baobab Brilliance, Perspectives on Audacity.
Of course. Happy
I,
to be here. Excited for our conversation.
Wonderful. I am wondering, what's a word or phrase that describes how you're entering in to this conversation we're about to have?
Rooted. Rooted. And of course, I'm going to give you two words. Like there's just a spaciousness in my life right now, and that I'm especially feeling today. And that perspective helps me to feel rooted. So that's how I'm entering. How about yourself?
I am entering open. It's raining here in New Hampshire, and I
Mhm.
always feel like the rain ends up bringing purification or something like new energy, wiping away what's no longer useful. And so I feel open to this conversation, and I know that you will have gems for me, as you usually do.
Okay.
And with that, I'm going to ask my first question, which is a throwback to February 2018.
Yes.
So 8 years ago, I had another interview series called Black and Bold, Perspectives on Leadership. And
Yeah.
you were my first interview.
Mm.
And in that conversation, I asked you what a headline for your leadership journey throughout your career would be. And this is what you told me. Quote, it would be something along the lines of, it's a journey. Very simple and understated, but represents the journey of discovery. We are often seeking a destination and are taught we are supposed to have a destination when life and career are very much a journey, end quote. So as a starting point, how would you describe the journey you've been on in the last 5 to 8 years?
That's such a great question. And you sharing that quote back with me puts me, it reminds me that journey is clearly my theme or my mantra. Maybe I literally was on a call earlier today reminding people about the journey, and I had a conversation with my therapist this week about it being a journey. And so it's funny hearing you say that back when I have said that word at least a few times this week, and is very much what centers the rootedness that I described entering the conversation today. How would you describe the journey that I've been on the last 5 to 8 years? Unpredictable. Unpredictable. So 5 years ago, I moved to Seattle, Washington to take a new role, high stakes role leading a foundation and in the Pacific Northwest. So, leaving from DC to go there, it was scary because it was a step up career wise. It was a different part of the country that I had never been in before and was known to be, what did someone say, wet and white? It was incredibly rainy there, and there were not known to be many people of color. There certainly aren't many Black people. And I had a big opportunity in terms of impact ahead of me. And so, embarking or following the advice of a very good friend, which is a quote I think has been used in other spaces and places, I find I'm more likely to regret the chances I didn't take than the ones that I did. I was not prepared, even though this thing was scary to me because there was so much that was new and unfamiliar. I decided I didn't want to regret not taking the chance, and I didn't want to wonder what if. And so I started out headed across the country in the middle of a pandemic solo, which I often say I do not recommend. But I took that opportunity to be one of discovery. And rather than comparing if, for example, Seattle to DC, DC to Seattle, with what Seattle did not have and all the great things DC had, I set out to discover what Seattle had from an asset perspective that DC didn't have. And I said yes to opportunities to meet people where I'm an introvert and I don't really like small talk. And that can be the kind of thing I'm like, I'm not feeling it today. No. And so that was part of the journey, was to just go into the unfamiliar and the unknown that felt like it was high with risk, but instead to seek to understand what I could learn and how I could grow and what I could do with the opportunity that was in front of me. And it turned out to be a wonderful, wild ride that despite some setbacks and even some trauma, I would say, I would do it all over again for the many ways that I grew and the community that I grew and the perspectives I've gotten and learned, et cetera, et cetera. And since then, I recently moved back to the DMV, which is not the Department of Motor Vehicles, but DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And I'm no longer leading that organization, but I am instead now working for myself. And it's not what I thought I would be doing at this point in my life, but it actually was something that I was planning to do, say, 5 or 6 years from now. And so when presented with yet another opportunity, I was like, oh, wait, I could do what I thought I wanted to do in 5 years now. Okay, didn't quite have a plan together, but let's go. And even as I seek what it means to create and what it means to discover, and yet a different environment that is professional and personal, my physical surroundings to new relationships, etc. That's been still scary and also settling and peaceful at the same time. And the last thing I'll say, that in terms of what I've been up to or what that journey has been like, is something that's become as top of mind for me, and that is health. And I participated in one of these 100 biomarker tests that I consider myself a pretty healthy person, and learned some things about myself that weren't great. Some of it due to hereditary things, some of it due to aging and perimenopause. And so I've just been on this journey to what optimal health looks like for myself, and how I love the word optimize, but how I kind of, if I want my body to be a certain way and function a certain way and have certain cognitive abilities, like how do I make sure the foods that I eat and the reflections that I'm doing and my spirituality, how does that health holistically line up to make the best me at this point in my life? So, long answer, but you did say 5 to 8 years. So that's the synopsis, or as much of a synopsis as I can give you.
Yeah, it was a long time horizon so that we could have some expansive reflection on your part.
Yes.
I'm actually reflecting on when we first entered each other's orbits, and I was living in New Orleans, and you were in New Orleans, leading new leaders for new schools. And so I think we first interacted in the education reform space, and you've since done so many things related to what I would say is making the world better for people. So from your public policy work, your time in government, your time as a social impact consultant, there's a lot of experiences that you've had, not in the last 5 to 8 years, that I think have been inputs to all that you just shared with us.
Okay.
Within the arc of your career, so longer than the 5 to 8 timeline that I gave, I want to think a little bit about audacity and vision. The subtext to this podcast is perspectives on audacity. And I think often as Black women, we are conditioned and or encouraged to maybe play small or think small. And you've had some really big jobs.
Mm.
in the work that you've done. And I'm curious about like what a decision is that you've made that felt risky at the time, but was necessary for long-term impact.
Mm.
And you can't say moving to Seattle because you kind of already answered this question. And Seattle is an answer, but I
Yeah.
know you have so many other greatest hits.
I will say, I feel like this has been the arc of my career and even my life. And I'm going to try to think of a decision, but while I describe that arc, which is like so many of us, I am a first generation college graduate, and my parents were hardworking people who wanted the best for my brother and me and would do whatever it took to give us that best, but also coming from mild and meager means, if you will. And I've always had a curiosity about me. My mother even said she could cut off my fingers when I was a baby and I would still touch things. Yeah, I like to think I was just that curious. But it was, I just, I remember traveling to Washington, D.C. When I was going to college and I had set my sights on Howard University. And I remember going there, I visited there with my then boyfriend's mother, who was also going there at the time, the boyfriend that is, of course. And it wasn't until I moved that I came to understand how different Washington, D.C. was compared to New Orleans. And you will appreciate both all the places you've lived, inclusive of New Orleans, that to go drinks did like you couldn't do that anywhere but New Orleans. You couldn't have alcohol in a cup and leave the bar. You couldn't, there weren't drive-through daiquiri shops. Red beans and rice were a thing unto itself in that place. And I just started to uncover such a wider world living in DC, going to the Mecca. And it started, the reason I describe it as an arc is because it really started. I didn't have anyone to follow. And I think that's the case for so many of us that are first generation college grads, but I didn't have much of a model to follow on how to do things and what to do. And so from deciding I was going to move away from home to go to college, and my parents really couldn't help me with that, the experience would be, to deciding I would move to Chicago to take a job in consulting, which I really didn't know much of anything about before my senior year in college, to going to New Zealand by myself because I wanted to go and I did not want to spend time coordinating with friends on all the things, when we'd go, how much we'd spend, et cetera, et cetera. And so I learned to make smart and calculated decisions, meaning before I went to New Zealand or before I went to Barcelona, I would research how to move safely in those areas, what to do in those areas, et cetera. But I also was not going to let being by myself or not having a model to follow be the thing that was going to hold me back from doing the thing. Time has always felt too precious to me.
Mm.
And I gave you the Seattle example, but it really is just the same way I talked about Howard or vacationing in New Zealand or Mexico for that matter, where women may not think they can go by themselves, but they can. Yeah, just to even to getting a divorce like 10 years into my marriage when no one else was and everyone was getting married still. It was just this kind of thing of I'm in the pursuit of happiness. And even taking the job in Chicago, becoming budget director, I tell people like, well, I like numbers and I like doing my own personal budget. And yes, this is billions of dollars, but let's go see. I have enough of the makings. And so I've been fortunate to have people in my life like you and so many others that even when I doubt myself, they've nudged me because I care enough about the thing. I care enough about the students in Chicago public schools. I care enough about the federal policy that impacts so much of what's happening in public education around our country. I care so much about the ability to move millions of dollars to organizations who are really making a difference in the lives of young people and entrepreneurs, so much that for all the risks that's involved with me, nothing compares to the impact that those moves could have on the people that I was doing it on behalf of.
See, I told you. I told you I was going to have some gems and some inspiration from this
Yeah.
conversation.
Much too kind, my friend, much too kind.
No, I just think that your trajectory has been so fascinating with all of the winding roads. I get
Yeah.
it. From philanthropy to government to now running your own consultancy to all the other things like budget director at CPS. There's a whole host of things that you've been a part of.
Yeah.
And I feel like policy, you mentioned policy and being able to shape some of the policies that are going to have huge impacts on the people that you're working in service of. Is there an example possibly where your lived experience gave you clarity that data or policy alone couldn't? I often find that think tanks are really stuck on maybe charts and numbers and graphs, but they end up setting aside the human factor or the realities of actual life on the ground. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, given the rooms that you've been in and the decision-making tables that you've been at, is there an experience where your lived experience was a key to unlocking something that wasn't in the PowerPoint deck?
Mm. It's interesting. What's coming to mind for me, which is a little, it is answering your question and it's working in a reverse, which is I remember working in New Orleans. And of course, the work that I did in New Orleans was about training and supporting teachers and teacher leaders to become principals of the public schools there. And I had done that work from '07 to 2007 to 11. And then I moved to DC to work for the US Department of Education. And I remember us talking about, we were debating a policy related to, I believe it was English language learners. And I won't get into the specifics of the policy, but what I knew and I understood was there was a desire to give a particular timeline of, say, maybe 3 years to implement this particular policy change. And I wanted to give it 2 years. And the person that I was working for at the time, we were pretty aligned in our policy decisions and thinking and direction. And after this particular policy meeting, we were talking, and he was, well, why were you more stringent, if you will? And I said, because I know how this gets implemented on the ground. And I said, I know that if we give 3 years, it's really like, in its implementation, it will be meant to be 4 or 5 for that matter. And we have an urgency about having an impact on kids and students that I think knowing that there's going to be a leniency that's coming, we need to make the guardrail narrower, knowing that the guardrail is going to automatically open more. And I feel really fortunate not having done policy work later in my career, both at Chicago Public Schools at the local level, but certainly at the federal level, that all the work I had done up to that point was about managing teams and managing organizations, but it was also about implementing solutions or designing and implementing interventions that would make a difference in, at that point, the lives of students and families. So I felt like I was much smarter going in to do that policy work at the federal level than I would have been had I done it the opposite way around. And likewise, we're at a strange, chaotic time in our country, of course. Things are just off the rails. And I think so much about how our country doesn't understand policy because some of the things that are being espoused that can be done by the executive office of the United States, for example, it can't be done. It just does not work that way. And that's not what people's day to day lives are about. It's not the lever that can be pulled by the federal government, for example. And so, yeah, I feel like I'm living this reality on a day to day basis, but also, as you described in the lived experience, that policy alone is necessary and extremely important, but also insufficient.
Hmm. Yeah. There's so many threads that are tangled and
Yes. It's
within these yet to be United States of America, to quote Pastor Moss. Okay, so I am wondering your identity. You mentioned being a first generation college student. You talked about your family roots and growing up in New Orleans. And I know you contain lots of multitudes with all the experiences that you've had.
Mhm.
I'm curious about how your identity as a whole has shaped what you're willing to challenge or refuse to accept in your work.
Mhm. Mhm. It's a word that's used a lot, but I'm not going to participate in work that will cause harm to communities that I care about the most, communities that are underprivileged. I grew up with, I am deeply connected to family and friends who've had a range of experiences from deep poverty to extreme wealth. And so I won't pretend to know every lived experience or the range of lived experience. Hardly, I would never claim to do that. And yet, I also know that if something is not going to serve a person or a community, then I won't do it. And it's a smaller example, but even right now, where I have a client that wanted us to do work in a couple of domains. This is a nonprofit like fundraising and theory of change. And I told the client, I could give you something to check the box, but it's not going to make a difference. And I don't do itty, put the two letters in front that you want. I don't do itty work. I'm not going to do substandard work because this organization has a mission to help the community in which it serves and to help to mitigate intergenerational poverty. And so I'm not going to put something forward that I know is not going to make a difference. And I'm also not going to put something forward that I think will harm the people or the communities. And I do that at a very individual level. And I also do that at the collective level, the systems level that you were alluding to, where my work has been. And that goes back to what I described in terms of family and friends. I've lived too much and I've been shaped too much by housing and healthcare and education. I've seen where it works and it doesn't work. And so I won't be a participant in exacerbating the system, at least not knowingly and willingly. I think we all are to some degree. We all are participating in the system, but where I can control or where I have control to not participate or to draw out a line, I try to.
You sound really deeply rooted, which brings me back to your opening word for our conversation. And is a nice segue to why I named this series Baobab Brilliance, Perspectives on Audacity, because the baobab tree is considered the tree of life. It's
Mm,
resistant to fire. It's really crucial for the ecosystems that it's occupying. And how Black women show up in the world reminds me of baobab trees.
mm,
So thinking about the examples that you just gave and how you don't do itty work, I am wondering where you're being called to be more audacious right now, since you are already audacious. Is there an area where there's more audacity that will be coming from Tyra?
Mm, it's a journey, so it's hard to say. Hard to say right now. I think it's a great question, and I'm sure one that I will sit with beyond our conversation. I think it's similar to the sentiment of rest as resistance. And I found that sometimes we're so used to grinding and having a certain life and having a certain career and how we're regarded, that can drive us to, that has driven me sometimes to behave in ways that are not necessarily what I want to do with myself and with my life. And the most tangible, I can, some of this is really live for me now, but I can give an example of, say, a year or so ago when I did decide I was going to work for myself, and some of my work includes facilitating, moderating leadership development groups to executive coaching and management consulting. And that shift from that formal leadership position to working for myself, I think in some ways, though I wouldn't, I could tell you how great it was. I also, it was such a shift in my identity, how I knew myself my entire adult life, how other people knew me, this sense of what greatness was, that there was a real tension for me and whether or not I was trying to think of the best way to describe it, of doing real work or whether it was real impact. And it took months and reflection and semantic work and mental, social, mental, emotional work, all that good stuff, to come to terms with the things that I was spending my life on, spending my time on rather, were so fulfilling to me. Like when I finished a client coaching call and I paid attention to the energy that I felt in my body and the energy I felt in my heart when I finished that call, which I couldn't say I had in that last full-time traditional role, I could come to terms with, regardless of what I may have thought about people doing this kind of work, the feeling, the passion, the energy that I get from it is priceless. And that allowed me to continue to pursue the road that I'm on. And even now, I find myself with a different, a portfolio of work, quote unquote, that I'm doing. And I only say quotes because how we define work is its own conversation. But that part of that rootedness is spacious, is to speak to the contentment that I have. And sometimes there's a little part of me that wants to tell me that I should be doing more or that I'm not doing enough. And I think the audaciousness right now, or where I'm called to be more audacious, is to stand in my sufficiency, in my peace, and in my contentment, and to not, comparison is the thief of joy, but to not look around and suggest that somehow I'm not doing enough when I am largely content with what I am doing and how I am contributing. So it's a different kind of audacity because it is standing solidly in one's truth when comparison will tell you it's not enough, period.
No, my silence is just receiving that wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's countercultural and counter conditioning to say, oh, contentment actually counts for something. Having
Yeah.
joy in the work that I'm doing matters more than what it says on my resume about being the president of XYZ. It's like, yeah, I feel like we get hoodwinked into thinking that there's some ladder to keep on climbing when really your rootedness doesn't have a price on it.
Right. Well said. Well said.
Oh, I'm just playing back what you said, Tyra. Just playing back what me.
Even the countercultural was like, yes, that's a perfect word, because it's to move against the grain is requires audacity.
Yeah. I feel like you're going to speak into someone when they hear this. Because that is one of the big challenges. I think about when I started Kairos and Heart, it'll be 5 years this August. And there was so much self-talk in my head around, can I do it? Like, who do I think I am starting my own thing? And it's more safe to be in someone else's, organization and company where I don't have to think about all the things. And it's been, there's hills and valleys and different seasons of the workflow, but it's been amazing to be in choice about every project that I take or don't take.
Yes. Liberation, I would argue. And yeah, let's be clear, this stuff, or it, put the 2 letters in front, it's hard.
Yes, shit is hard.
It's hard. So yeah, it's hard, and there's a lot of insecurity and uncertainty in it, and yet there is liberation, there's freedom in that. So yes, 100%. Ashe.
I also appreciate your point around the work you did mentally, socially, like all the things in order to call in this season, because my therapist and my coach, they were instrumental and still are in how I'm navigating and just getting to the place of the confidence to start my own thing. And then also to do the boundary setting that's required with clients when you are self-employed and how you do that dance. And yeah, double tapping on the external resources to help with navigation.
Yes, it really is key. I just another talking about external resources. I've run organizations, right? And so I know the finance and the technology and all those things. And oh my goodness, turning around something that exists or building on what exists, if it's in a healthy place, is fundamentally different from starting from scratch. And so there was a part of me that's, this stuff, you can do it. And then eventually I had to surrender and be like, no, I should just get an accountant, making this way harder for myself than it needs to be. And my life was so much easier once I did that. But it was a surrendering of what I thought I could and should do, only to, you just got to know when to call on the experts, whether it's mental health or physical health or your books, to help us navigate this thing called life.
Yeah. Awesome. This has been, before I ask my final question, I want to give you your flowers, because that's why I like having my own podcast. Not only do I like to talk, but I also like to talk to people I love and care about and respect. And so,
That exists.
yeah. And so my flowers are, I am grateful for the way that you move in the world. I'm thinking about one of the last times I saw you in Aspen at some gathering, and we had some time to chat. And you are just you're so generous with your expertise and your time. And you also don't suffer fools, which I really appreciate. And I'm just really excited for whatever is coming up next for you on your journey, because my world is definitely brighter with you in it. And I know there's so many other people that you touch in a really powerful way. So I thank you for being part of this conversation with me today.
Truly a pleasure. And thank you for those flowers. I humbly receive them.
Yay. So my last question is, what's a word or phrase that describes how you are leaving our energy exchange?
Ooh, so many good words coming up. Gratitude. Just gratitude for the moment that we're in, gratitude for the time to talk and share with you, gratitude for your friendship, just gratitude for life. Yeah, that's what I'm feeling the most. And yourself?
Amen to that.
What's your word? You have to give a word.
My word is light. I feel like you're a ray of sunshine. And I'm just, yeah, I'm thinking back to some of the gems that you dropped in this conversation that were like speaking to my soul. So I also have gratitude. Gratitude for your light.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure. Anytime. Until next time.
Until next time.